Hello, welcome to The Horticulturalists. I am Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
And we post every Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to follow our continuing horticultural adventures.
And don't forget, if you've got a question you'd like to ask me, please put it in the comments below. Tell me where you're from so that I've got context, and we will answer your question hopefully on our Monday shorts.
We won't, you will.
All right, I will.
I'll read them out because that's my special talent. Yeah. Bit of housekeeping, any plants that we do mention in today's video will be in the copy below. If you can't see it immediately, just press read more and bing, there they all will be.
Good. What a great idea. It's very useful, is it not, to have the name?
It is.
All right, so today,
yes,
we are back at one of my favourite gardens on Mount Macedon. They're all my favourites really, but nonetheless, this one I have a particularly long history with, and it's Duneira, which is a beautiful 1870s Mount Macedon estate.
Yes, what a beautiful place. Now, we have made several films in this garden, so we'll put them all together in a playlist, so you'll be able to watch them all, because it is a stunning, very large. It's large. Is it very large? It's just large. It's a large garden.
Well, by anybody's perspective, I would call this a large garden, yes.
Well, compared to mine, which is two narrow strips at the front, this is the size of a small nation.
Yes,
anyway.
Exactly. Yes.
It probably is the size of Liechtenstein.
Yes, or Luxembourg, or
Andorra.
Or Monaco.
Anyway, let's move on. Stephen, why are we here today?
All right, well, today I thought we'd go for a walk around the garden and we'd have a look at a series of some of the really notable and interesting trees that are in the garden. Like all of these big gardens in the area, part of the fun of it for the owners was collecting rarities to add to their tree collection so that they could show them off to their neighbours and friends and go, look what I've acquired for the garden. And so there was this whole collector's instinct thing that was going on back in the 1870s, 1880s and so forth. And so almost every garden up here has got something, well, you can hardly call any plant unique because you can always propagate another one. But certainly rarely seen plants that have found a home in some of these gardens at Mount Macedon.
And we have visited a few other gardens on Mount Macedon with a similar sort of narrative. So we'll link that playlist below as well, which is historic garden visits. Well, I think without further ado, we should go for a wander. And I want you to tell me your history with this garden.
Oh,
Stephen.
yes. Well, I can do that as well.
So before we get into the history of the garden, Stephen, tell us Stephen Ryan's history of this garden.
All right, well, I grew up in a property just opposite, so this was more or less my backyard. I knew the gardener.
Lucky you.
Yeah, well, you know, got to have somewhere to play. The gardener who was here, Hamish McVinney, was the old school gardener from the old country, and he had two children, young Hamish and Janet, and I used to spend most of my misspent youth here playing in this garden with Hamish and Janet, raiding the vegetable garden, having little feasts hidden under the trees, and generally doing all those things that small children do in a wonderful space like this.
It sounds very Secret 7 meets Beatrix Potter.
It was a little bit, but we didn't have a dog called Timmy. Not only did I spend my childhood here, or at least a fair percentage of it, but as I grew up, I got to know the owner of the time, Mrs. Wickens, and she owned the garden from the 1940s-ish. It was given to her as a wedding present by her dad.
Oh, no way.
Yes.
Alas, what am I going to get for my wedding present?
Yeah, well, I was in the wrong family as well, I have to say. Then later owners became personal friends, and so I spent a lot of time with Keith and Rex wandering the garden, selecting sites for yet more rare and interesting trees to add to the garden's biodiversity.
So you've worked here or consulted here both as sort of a garden consultant, I guess, but then also childhood scamperings.
Yes, exactly. So I have a very long history with this garden, probably longer than any of the owners, actually, thinking about it.
So what are some of the key things then that we're going to look at that you might remember from your childhood?
Well, there is a tree, which was in fact where, as small children, we used to come and camp with our ill-gotten gains from the vegetable garden. And in fact, Dad, Hamish, ended up having to put a lock on the berry house to keep us kids out.
So Stephen, who was the founder of this garden?
Well, his name was Suetonius Officer, and he was
a
wealthy...
name.
Yes, there's a name. He was a wealthy pastoralist, obviously of originally Scottish descent. He was the one that started off with the grand plans to create this garden.
Aha, well, thank you, Suetonius.
Yes.
Well, why have we stopped here, Stephen?
Well, we're under a tree. We stop at every tree we come to.
Spreading chestnut tree?
No, but you're not far off the mark.
Yes.
It's actually a walnut. And one might say, well, why would you stop worrying about a walnut? Because, you know, they're everywhere and you can buy the nuts in the greengrocers and so forth.
I love them.
This one is quite a unique walnut in lots of ways. And it's the cut-leafed walnut.
Yes.
Now, it's a form of black walnut, Juglans nigra, and it's the cut-leafed version, which then means it's Juglans nigra laciniata. And it has these amazing cut leaflets, so it has this beautiful ferny effect.
Right.
And when the new leaves come out, they've got that lovely coppery colour to them, but they'll go green when they're mature. But it's the most lovely feathery tree, and you think of walnuts as being big, gutsy, sort of butch type of trees, but this one's really nice and soft and light and charming. And I think one of the most interesting things about it, in fact, is even though it's a selection of a common walnut, it comes true to seed. And in most cases, if you've got a selection of something, you have to graft it or grow it from cuttings or whatever, because seedlings rarely come true to form. This one does. So if I raise some walnuts off this instead of eating the walnuts, and you can, of course, I would end up with more cut-leaf walnut.
Interesting. Now, it is quite late in the season, in spring.
Yeah, it's late spring.
It's only just beginning to unfurl. So do walnuts, are they slower to open?
Well, this particular species, Juglans nigra, does tend to be reasonably slow to wake up in the spring, which actually makes it quite useful in a sense, because it allows light in until the weather actually starts to warm up. Then it leafs out, and so therefore, as shelter for woodland things, it's actually quite good because it allows them to get as much light as possible. And lots of people will tell you not to grow walnuts in your garden if you want to grow things under them, because they supposedly exude a toxin that inhibits plant growth under them. But I have to say that doesn't seem to be having any impact. Under this walnut tree, there's thalictrums and there's arums and there's crocosmias, there's rhododendrons. There's a whole range of different plants growing perfectly well under this particular walnut.
So that urban myth shot down.
Or at least in this garden.
And that point about slow to leaf, meaning woodland ephemeral plants have more of a chance. We will link our wonderful woodland garden story with your neighbour Kath, because you make that point very strongly, that these types of trees are fantastic for that environment.
Oh yes, because it just gives those woodlanders that little bit of extra time to catch that spring sun before the tree leaves out, so that they can get themselves nice and ready to go into dormancy.
There you go. All right, well, let's go on to the next.
Good.
Another tree in our Duneira garden tree epic. What is this one? It's an odd looking thing.
Well, it takes me back definitely to my childhood. This is a plant of Chamaecyparis lawsoniana aurea, golden lawson cypress. It's unfortunately senescing, so it's getting very sick and miserable, unfortunately.
That's code for dying.
Yes, well, it is a bit. And it's a fascinating tree because the main part of the body of the tree is way back in the centre over there.
Yes.
And the side branches have hit the ground, taken root, and so in a sense we've got a whole thicket of tree trunks.
It's extraordinary.
And it is, it's quite remarkable. When I was a child, the branches used to come down and sweep all the way to the ground, so you couldn't see inside. And this was definitely the place to hide when you had just been raiding the vegetable garden and had all your ill-gotten gains. And this is where Hamish, Janet and I used to sit in there, and then we'd eat till we were full, and I'd get home and my mother would wonder why I didn't want dinner.
So where is this tree from then?
Well, it's North American. You'll find them growing on the west coast. There's a big area of Lawson cypress there. In fact, I've stood in a forest of them. And they grow in quite rocky areas, and they tend to grow as individual trees with gaps between. Unfortunately, there's a nasty fungal disease that's giving them a hiding in the wild, and I'm not altogether sure that there might not be something fungal about what's going on with this one, apart from having to go through bushfires, droughts, all sorts of weird weather conditions that we've had over the last few decades. So it may be a combination problem for this poor Lawson cypress. But I'll be very sad if it ever disappears, because this is definitely a tree that fits neatly into my history.
It's an amazing, amazing tree. This habit is really quite extraordinary. Well, on to the next.
Good. All right, Matthew, I'm going to lead you up the garden path and we're going to go and have a look at a tree that epitomises what I see as the important aspect of keeping a garden vibrant and new and young
Yeah.
by adding botanical diversity to the garden, which of course is what the original owners were doing as well. So when a new plant comes along that fits the ethos of the garden,
Yeah.
it should be purchased and planted.
From you?
Well, hopefully from me, but not necessarily. But these gardens should be not necessarily modernised, but the collection should keep growing because that's in fact how they started.
All right. Well, let's go and have a look. I'm intrigued what it is.
Oh, I've got a big surprise for you. All right, Matthew, I've brought you up to the top end of the garden to have a look at a comparatively new acquisition in this garden. And it's a quite handsome and reasonably well-grown specimen of the Wollemi Pine.
Yes.
Wollemia nobilis.
Now, many people have asked us to talk about this tree because
Yes.
it has cropped up in a few background shots of other films. Well, here we are. This is our moment, Wmy Pine.
Yes, exactly.
Firstly, is it a pine?
No, it's in the Aurea family. So the common name, although the Wollemi bit I get because that's the name of the national park it was discovered in, the business about calling it a pine is rather sad because it's not a pine. It's in the same family with the monkey puzzles and the bunyas and a lot of those other southern hemisphere Aurea.
And we have a video about many New Caledonian ones, which we'll link.
Yeah, so, and it was only discovered in 1994 by David Noble. So there's a play on words in the name of Wmy Pine actually, because Wollemia is where it came from, and nobilis would mean noble or big, but it also is the name of the person who actually discovered it.
Aha.
So it's actually a fun sort of play on words, and it is a very primitive conifer, and I'm convinced if Suetonius Office had seen one of these, he would have had to have had it in his garden immediately.
Yeah.
So it's actually carrying on the whole idea of how these gardens evolved by adding something new but rare and interesting into the collection of the garden, and they've put it in a quite modern-esque landscape feel here. So it's a really interesting and different sort of aspect to this garden. So it isn't being held in aspic or anything.
Yeah.
The garden is evolving and new things are being planted that are at least in context with the garden.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't put a cactus in a fernery. So, you wouldn't plant something completely weird into this garden that didn't fit. But of course, conifers were very popular in Victorian times, and this would have been just the bee's knees had it been around then.
So, for all of our viewers around the world, I mean, there are Wollemis available in Britain and in the States.
Yeah.
So what are the ideal growing conditions? It was found in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales.
Yes.
Relatively high elevation.
Yeah, well, in a dark gorge, really. So in a very sheltered, cool, damp environment. The sun would never have got to the root system of a Wmy Pine in the wild.
And yet, here we are in full sun.
But it's got a gravel mulch.
Ah, right.
It's got other plants growing around it. It is in a sheltered garden, and of course it's got altitude here as well, so it's flourishing. And in fact, it has got male strobili, which are the male cones, which are the brown hangy bits.
Yeah.
And it's got some female cones forming up the top, which are sort of round green ball-like cones. So it is actually doing its thing as well.
I see them growing in Melbourne, so that's
Yeah.
much lower elevation, hotter and drier.
Yeah.
Could they take cold? I mean, could you grow them outside in, say, southern Britain or parts
Oh
of the
yes,
States?
yes. There's a couple of them growing in the Jardin de Plantes in Paris.
Yeah.
I've seen them in the south of England. There's actually a big planting of them planned as we speak as a biosecurity thing to look after them in Britain.
Oh, right.
So they're planting a largish quantity of them to protect them, because it was only a couple of years ago that a fire went zooming through the Wollemi National Park, and if it hadn't been for the attention of the government with regards to putting water over the Wollemi pines, we could have lost all of the wild plants. So we do need to have ex situ collections of them, and one of them is going to be in Britain.
Now, I've actually never seen an image of a mature one. So, I mean, we've seen those other New Caledonian trees,
Yeah.
which can be very tree-like, for want of a better
Yeah.
word. My impression of this is that it's always a bit straggly and quite slim. I mean, is that
Yeah.
the case as it gets older?
In fact, if anything, it becomes more pronounced with age, because what happens is the lower limbs will slowly drop off the tree, so you'll end up with a tall, slender trunk, or maybe trunks, because sometimes it can be multi-stemmed.
Yeah.
The bark becomes sort of bubbly, like chocolate Rice Krispies or something. It's rather weird.
Okay.
So you get this really weird trunk, and the foliage will migrate up the tree, so that only the top part of the tree will actually have foliage on it. So a power pole with leaves on the top, I guess you could say.
So you're not really painting a super attractive picture. I mean, quite tricky to use maybe effectively in a garden.
Well, the issue with them is because they're a tree with such incredible presence, that you need to use them as a focal point. So, and that's exactly what's happened here. It's at the end of a big car park where when they have big functions here, people can come up and park. And so it's right at the end of a view line. So if you come in from the far end of the car park, you'll see this enormous Wollemi Pine at the end. So it's, I guess, a piece of sculpture, albeit green and growing, in an appropriate setting. So you might have once had Cleopatra's Needle there instead.
Or a monkey puzzle tree.
Yeah, or a monkey puzzle tree would have been another alternative. So yes, the Wollemi has nestled nicely into Duneira, and it's sort of one of those plants that should be here, you know, because of the collection of interesting trees that are already here.
Well, fantastic. All right, well, let's go and explore other fabulous things in this garden.
I think we must.
Oh, well, this almost needs no explanation. Well, it does, but what a tree!
It is over 100 years old. It's a flowering cherry that we would call Mount Fuji here. It is Prunus serrulata Shirotae, and I mean, it's gorgeous when it's in flower and it's got just a smattering of blooms still left on it. But in a sense, who cares? The tree is just so incredibly wonderful with its gnarly, twisty form, covered in moss. It is just wonderful. I mean, it's the sort of thing that children would see and immediately think of something, I don't know, Harry Potter-esque or something like that. It's just the most amazing, gnarly, interesting and beautiful tree, which probably was planted by the Reeds back in the turn of the last century up till about the 1920s. So sometime around about then. So it'll be over 100 years old now, and it is one of the most impressive trees in the whole garden, I think.
And I mean, it's on an incredible lean, I have to say.
Well, it is propped, which it sort of needs to have, otherwise the whole thing might peel itself out of the ground. But that does show a point. I mean, they've done the right thing by propping the tree. And in Japan and most parts of Asia, they would do exactly the same thing. They would keep a tree standing by using props and other sort of support mechanisms to make sure that the tree stays there for yet another 100 years, hopefully.
Absolutely beautiful. Well, this is an amazing tree, but wait, there are more.
Yeah, there definitely are more.
What magic tree is this, Stephen?
Well,
looks like a coffee to me.
Yes, well, believe it or not, it's a holly.
What?
Yes.
It hasn't got
no prickles,
remotely any hollyish characteristics, apart from red berries.
Yes, and it gets those in masses. They come in great sort of lengths along the stems. This is Ilex kingiana. It's a holly from the Himalayas.
Oh.
And it grows into a biggish tree. And probably has, I think, the largest leaf in the genus. So, yeah, the leaves in the old measurements are easily 6 inches long. No thorns, so it's non-prickly. And this is a female tree, hence berries.
Right.
You know, so there's plant sex 101. But it's interesting that it is fruiting. So there's no male Ilex kingiana in the garden here. So it must be being pollinated probably by the straight English holly, Ilex aquifolium. So if one was to raise seed from this, assuming it's fertile, you wouldn't end up with Ilex kingiana, you'd end up with some sort of hybrid swarm of seedlings.
Which could be fabulous, but also might not.
And I wouldn't be bothered either, because if you raise them from seed, it may be many years away before you find out whether you've got male and female plants, even if you know you've got a hybrid. So if you want berries, then the only way to deal with this tree is to actually grow it from cuttings.
Right. What a handsome tree, and I would never have thought it was a holly. And honestly, the way those berries are growing, don't you think it looks like coffee? Yeah,
well, I wouldn't drink it, I have to say. But I love it. I think it's just such a wonderful tree, and I only know of three in the Mount Macedon area. One of them is growing at Ardhilly, which is a male tree, and there's one growing in Sefton, which is one of the other big properties on the mountain, and theirs is also a male tree. So this is the only female tree I know of its type.
Lucky her.
Yes, I think so too.
So why have we stopped here, Stephen?
All right. Well, there's part of the story of my connection with this garden here as well.
Yes.
Behind us are 3 large Nothofaguses. 2 Nothofagus fusca, which is the New Zealand red beech, and 1 Nothofagus solandri, which is the mountain beech. And they were planted by Betty Wickens back in the late 60s-ish sometime, 1960s we're talking about. They're actually in the wrong place because they're still young trees and they've still got a lot of growing to do.
Really? They're massive.
Yeah, well, they're still nowhere near as big as they can get. They were inappropriately planted in some ways.
It wasn't you?
No. Mrs. Wickens did some good things, but she obviously came home with these from the Dandenongs or somewhere and went, where were we going to put them? And wandered around the garden and said, look, there's a gap there, let's shove them in there. And so, of course, they're going to get rather too large for this part of the garden, which is known as the secret garden. And my long-term plan many years ago and 3 owners ago was to, in fact, plant some more of these Nothofaguses. So I was going to source some fusca and some solandri and perhaps some Menzies eye and some of the other South American ones, dot them around the garden as major lawn specimen trees, and then eventually have these ones taken down to bring the secret garden back to what it should be, where it should be a light, sunny area hidden in the middle of the garden. So they won't get taken down now. I can't imagine anybody would have the temerity to take those trees down because they're quite a good size now. But they really were badly placed in the first place. So if they'd been planted out in the middle of a lawn, even as close as they are here, it would have been fine. But having them in the middle of a garden that is comparatively small in scale, and they're going to grow into towering giants, they're already starting to push the rock walls down that they're planted above. So long term it could be an issue. If I had my way, and I don't because I'm not part of the trustees here at the property, I would definitely be planning for the future, putting some Nothofagus, fusca and solandri out in the garden as major specimen trees, and then with the intention of having these ones taken down in due course.
Well, they are magnificent.
Oh, they are. They're gorgeous, but they are trees in the wrong spot, unfortunately.
I just want to also mention, we are standing in the secret garden on a moss lawn, and it is like standing on cloud.
It's sort of like shag pile with really thick underfelt.
It's really beautiful.
It is really, really spongy and it's gorgeous.
All right, on to the next secret of the secret garden.
Let's go.
Well, Stephen, I thought this was a tree story. This
it is a tree story.
A thicket of whatever.
Well, this is a Clethra. Cthra Araria. Arborea means tree-like, so somebody else thought it was a tree as well. And it comes from Madeira. It's supposedly extinct in the wild in the Canaries and is an introduced pest species on the Azores. So, and I'm going to be visiting Madeira and the Azores in 2024, leading a tour. So I'm hoping that I will see wild specimens of Cthra Araria whilst I'm there, because this tree goes back in my history right to, well, as far back as I can remember living on Mount Macedon, because it flowers in the late summer, autumn, has little white lily of the valley-like flowers and is often in fact called a lily of the valley tree, although there are a number of things with that same name. And it has the most evocative and interesting musky fragrance. Once you've smelt it, you'll never forget the scent. And of course, walking from my house the 2 miles to school and walking back from school to my house every day during the school days, in the autumn, I could smell it wafting from all of the gardens on Mount Macedon because virtually everybody has a Clethra. And every time I smell it in bloom, it takes me immediately back to my childhood. And I'm not sure whether that's good or bad.
No, it depends. But it's not really a tree. I mean, it's a thicket. Now, is this the normal growth pattern? Does it always just make a thicket of suckers? Are they suckers? What's going on?
Some of it's suckers, some of it will be layers. And of course, you can manage and control that and make it much more tree-like just by removal of some of that stuff. I mean, here it's on the edge of a driveway and they've just trimmed it back to keep it off the driveway. And it's sort of become a hedgy effect, in fact. So it's really weird how you can grow and use this plant. And it's not wholly hardy to cold. It will cope with the few degrees of frost we have here, but certainly take it to England or parts of North America, it's likely to get damaged by the cold in some of those colder parts. You could probably grow it fine in Cornwall, but it grows superbly at Mount Macedon, and probably some of the biggest specimens I've ever seen, unless of course I see some in the wild even bigger, are growing here on Mount Macedon, and some of them would easily be 40, maybe even 50 feet tall. So size-wise, they certainly are trees.
It is massive, but I think the other thing is, like girth-wise, I think you just need to be very aware what this tree / thicket could do if you're going to plant one?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's taken 80 or 100 years to do this.
Okay.
So
And your point always is, that's not your problem.
yeah, exactly. It'll be somebody else's issue in due course. And so I would still plant them. And it does make me laugh because when I see them for sale in nurseries here in Australia, they often have a pictorial label on them with Lily of the Valley tree in big writing, the botanical name in tiny writing, and you turn the label over and on the back it says, large evergreen shrub, 2 to 3 metres. Now, it could do the 2 to 3 metres within 10 to 12 years easily, and maybe that's what they mean by their labelling, but they should be a little bit more specific and let people know that under good conditions, they can grow substantially bigger than that.
It's a monster. All
Yeah.
right, well, let's go and look at other trees in this garden.
All right?
Stephen, you seemed very whimsical and attached to this tree.
As I should.
Why?
Well, because I sold this tree to one of the previous owners.
It looks 100 years old.
And I don't. You should see my portrait up in the,
On the
loft.
attic.
Yes.
It is. I mean, it's an incredible tree.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Tell us
all right.
everything.
This is Nothofagus, which makes it a southern beech. Nothofagus dombeyi. It's one of the South American species. There's 3 or 4 evergreen ones. There's a couple of deciduous ones.
Yep.
And in fact, South America has more extant species than anywhere else. And of course the Nothofaguses, although there is some dispute about whether they'll all stay Nothofaguses because they're talking about cutting up the genus, but the Nothofaguses are one of those groups of plants that in fact do help explain the Gondwana theory and the continental drifts, etc. So South America has more than anywhere else. New Zealand has, I think, 5 accepted species. Australia has 3.
Oh, 3? Because
Yeah.
there's the one in Tasmania, the only, or this is a hotbed, but
Yeah.
the only
Deciduous native tree.
exclusively native to this
Yeah,
country.
is Nothofagus gunnii, but we also have Nothofagus cunninghamii, which is
Oh.
the myrtle beech,
Oh.
and we have Nothofagus moorei, which we'll have a look at some point.
And what's the one from the Otway Ranges here?
That's Nothofagus cunninghamii.
Right.
So it grows in the southern parts of Victoria, and then the big forests of it tend to be down in Tasmania.
And the ones here in the Otway Ranges are beautiful. It is like a Jurassic Park environment. It's a cool, temperate rainforest, isn't it? Beautiful.
Exactly. And these trees are all remnants of that rainforest era in Australia and the other continents that were once joined to us. In fact, they've found fossil remains of Nothofagus in Antarctica as well, because that was all part of Gondwana too.
So, I mean, a gentleman doesn't ask, Stephen, but how long ago did you sell this tree?
I'm guessing, knowing the different owners and which one had the property here at the time, that it must have been in the late 70s that I
Right.
sold this tree to the owner of the time. And it has grown remarkably well.
It's got a beautiful form. It's very sort of wedding teary
Yeah.
and a lovely habit.
And it's flowering, which is
Yeah.
interesting because I've never been in the garden in the last few years to see it in bloom, and I'm not altogether sure that this might not be its first blooming after all this time, because the beeches, both Nothofaguses and the northern beeches, have what are called mast years. So they'll do no flowering for several years, and then suddenly the tree will flower prolifically and produce vast quantities of seed, and that's to protect itself from predation of its seed, because if it has a huge quantity one year and then nothing the next, then whatever eats it isn't going to be able to build up quantities. So it looks to me like this Nothofagus dombeyi might be going to have a mast year this year, so I will have to come back and see if there's any seed on my little baby tree.
And they're quite pretty little flowers. They're very scarlet. It sort of stands out quite beautifully against...
Yeah, they're pretty. I mean, they're not flower lovers' flowers in a way.
You
They're-
wouldn't buy this for the flower, but
No.
it's interesting.
Yeah, so they're a really pretty and interesting tree, and in a good deep soil, in a cool climate, they can grow like fury, so they can put on 3 or 4 feet a year.
All right, cool climate. Let's drill into it. You said there were evergreen and deciduous. What's this one?
This one's evergreen.
And what is its hardiness?
Again, you'd only grow it in the south of England. You could grow it in North America, but not right up in the northern states or up into Canada. Again, like a lot of these cool forest trees, they're not also going to cope with hot tropics either. So they like a slightly more Mediterranean style climate, but without having too hot a summer to go with it. So yes, specific requirements, but if you've got the right conditions for them and a garden big enough to deal with them, Why not indeed?
Why not indeed?
Yeah,
Well,
I think they're wonderful.
well done you for getting this planted here. It's a stunning tree.
I reckon another year or two from now and they'll put a National Trust classification on it. You never know.
How do you feel when you see something like this that you
Old.
were involved? Oh,
Yeah. Whenever I see a tree of this sort of dimension, and there's others in the garden here that are, I would say, on a par with this basically. They were all trees I had something to do with sourcing and helping the owners site and plant, although I didn't dig the holes personally. I leave that to the minions.
I was going to say, you're above hole digging.
Yeah, well, not my own garden, I have to dig holes, but in other people's gardens, I rarely ever dig a hole. But I certainly helped them place out where the trees were going to go, and there was always a reason behind each tree. So this one was planted here mainly to add to the diversity of that genus already in the garden, and others were planted because they fitted the theme of the garden and added to the botanical diversity. So there was always a reason. It wasn't just let's plonk in another tree.
And this is the point that we were mentioning with the Wollemi, is that although the garden began in a very particular era stylistically and horticulturally, gardens, and it's not necessarily evolving and changing, it's simply still doing what they always did, which was be a receptacle for collecting, really.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the whole raison d'etre behind all of the gardens on Mount Macedon. Everybody had to have the newest, the best, the only one of, and that was what they lived off.
And there were versions of you selling them, Stephen.
Oh yes, very clever nurserymen back in those days.
Indeed. Well, let's go and look at something else that's fabulous in this garden.
All right, here we have a fantastic specimen of Liriodendron tulipifera, the tulip tree from North America.
Now, we saw a beautiful one in that other garden, which we'll link below. But this one has a very strange form. What's going on here?
Well, the base of the tree is a huge burl, and burls often come about due to a fungal infection or something like that. And so the plant grows this amazing sort of warty-like structure around the problem to circumvent it. Now, normally the tulip trees grow up into big, tall, elegant trees.
Very kind of symmetrical.
Yeah, but this one has grown into this amazing, gnarled, weird shape. So just because of its unusual form, this tree, I think, is of particular note in this garden, because I've never seen a specimen of Liriodendron that looked even vaguely like this one.
No, it is beautiful. It's very gothic and looks like it's going to chase you. But
well, we've just got past Halloween, so it could have been a good tree to have in your garden for Halloween.
There you are. All right, well, let's go on to the next amazing thing in this garden. Stephen, another tree.
Yes, and another Nothofagus. And this is what sort of started the whole ball rolling when it comes to this group of plants in this particular garden. Because as a child, obviously this tree was still here, I'm not that old, and was probably planted by Suetonius Officer. And there was a Nothofagus Cunninghamii, the myrtle beech, further down the garden, which unfortunately got burnt and killed in the Ash Wednesday bushfires in 1983. So there was two large Nothofaguses in this garden, and I'm sure that's what got Betty Wickens going to put more Nothofaguses in, and it was certainly what got me going to put the South American one into the garden. But the interesting thing about this tree, apart from the fact that it's a very impressive specimen of its type, is that back in the 1870s, Australian native plants were generally looked down on. We didn't talk about forests and woodlands, we talked about scrub and bush. So it was always derogatory terms about our native plants. And so it was very unusual to see some of these plants being used in gardens of that era, because it was always about elms and northern hemisphere conifers and all those sorts of plants that people were familiar with. So to have planted two of the three Australian native Nothofaguses in this garden, probably in the 1870s or 1880s, is weird. I just cannot get my head around how this happened, because it's a most unlikely event to have these planted back then.
Well, lucky
so
us,
there you
though,
go.
because it's a beautiful tree. Now, but you didn't say where this is from.
Oh, it comes from the mountains in New South Wales.
Right.
So it comes from up in sort of further north than most of the other Nothofaguses. And it's a remnant plant from the ancient Gondwanan rainforests. And it only grows in a fairly isolated area in New South Wales. I would guess that it could be considered as vulnerable or at risk or whatever in the wild. It does make a very large, so therefore not ordinary garden tree, and its new growth when it gets it, which will happen in another month or so, is a most magnificent salmon pink. And it's one of the larger leafed of the Nothofaguses. There are one or two from New Caledonia that have even bigger leaves, but they're quite tropical species. All of the temperate to cold climate ones tend to have quite small leaves, and this one's got probably leaves on about the biggest scale you can get in the cold climate ones.
It is a stunning tree, and I guess to contextualize again, so that is a mountain, a cool forest mountain tree.
Yeah, so dampish conditions,
Yeah.
deep acid soils, cool climate, but not really, really cold.
No, so not that hardy.
No,
No.
no.
And not a tropical lover either.
No, exactly, yet again.
All right, on to the next.
Yes, let's go.
And this, Stephen Ryan?
Yes, well, not the world's most prepossessing looking tree.
No, handsome enough.
Handsome enough, but you know, you could easily take a tree out like this without realising just how rare and important it could be.
Yes.
And that's why it's always a good idea to find out what a tree is before you take it down. I regularly get people who come into the nursery and they have a branch in their hand and they say, "What was this?"
And what is this?
This is a southern Japanese hemlock, Tsuga sieboldii, and as far as I know, it's one of two on Mount Macedon, and there's probably not too many of them in Australia apart from those two. And it's a small multi-trunk tree, so it's not, you know, a major forest tree or anything like that, but it has the cutest little cones, and it's a very pleasant dark green tree, I guess. But its main interest is in fact in its serious rarity as far as Australia is concerned. And these are plants that we really need to protect and probably propagate, because if we ever lose the couple that are here, then there's very little likelihood that somebody's going to go to the effort to try and import them again. So whilst we've got them, we need to protect them.
Well, there's lots of cones on this one. Have you grown it from seed?
No, I haven't tried, but that is certainly one of the plans, is to perhaps get some cones with some viable seed. I'll also have a crack at growing it from cuttings. There should be no real reason why it shouldn't strike from cuttings. Most of the other hemlocks will. So I might try that as well. And if we're lucky, we might find some seed in the cones.
There we are.
So
Fantastic.
we'll give it a go.
And Stephen, we seem to be ending on a lawn of new plantings.
Yes, there's quite a few newish trees that have gone in here. There's been storm damage, fire damage in '83, so a lot of new things have been planted over that period of time. And one of the trees that's been planted, and again, I didn't dig the hole, but I supplied the tree, is the dawn redwood that's down there.
So that's the pale green
Yes, and it's botanically known as fabulously Metasequoia glyptostroboides.
Oi, oi, oi.
Now, that's another tree that Heritage Victoria told me shouldn't be here because it was only discovered in the 1940s. But it works perfectly well in this garden. It fits in with everything else here. And in fact, over to the other side of it is a larch, which is another deciduous conifer. So it fits in with the whole theme of this part of the garden, in fact. And the dawn redwood, I hate to say, is a serious tree now, and it came via me, which is... I'm really feeling my age today.
So it was discovered in the 1940s?
Yes, yes, as a living plant. They'd known of it from fossil remains, just like the Wollemi was basically known from fossil remains, just like the ginkgo was known from fossil remains. But all three of those trees were assumed extinct until they were all rediscovered. So there's a bit of a theme going on there as well.
Yeah. Stephen, what a wonderful romp through the rare and wonderful trees. Duneira.
Yeah, and it is a wonderful garden, so if you ever get the opportunity to visit during bluebell time, or if you've got a group that you want to bring through the garden, go onto their website, and I'm sure you will have a day to remember if you can come and visit Duneira.
Well, I have. I've never been here before, and it is a stunning garden, and there is so much to see, and it's vast acreage to wander around. So many thanks to the trustees and the head gardener here for allowing us to wander around.
Yes, and I hope to be back here again in my capacity as a consultant to do some more sneaky planting around the garden.
Well, who knows? And if you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe. So do that. And do leave a question in the comments below if you have a question for Stephen Ryan.
Yes, and I will try and answer it in 60 seconds or less on our Monday shorts.
Until then, though, we'll see you next week.
Bye all.